thank you, David. Thank you, Joanna. Kia ora koutou katoa. Wonderful to be here to speak to the Nelson Tasman community. I'm just going to share my screen, so hopefully the technology works. And we should come up with a title slide once I do that. How is that looking? Can you see Parliament?
Yes.
Yes, you can. And that's full screen. That's all good?
Yep.
Great. All right. So the reason I am talking about the implications of sea level rise for the Tasman and Nelson region, the reason I'm showing a shot of Parliament with 1.5 metres sea level rise is that there is a lot happening right now in New Zealand on the legislative front. And I guess front of mind for most of you will be that we have an emissions reduction plan to get to 2050, to get to zero carbon by 2050, to do our bit for the Paris Climate Agreement. We also have a national adaptation plan that is there to protect New Zealand, manage the impacts of climate change, depending on the future we have. And hopefully that's a future where we keep global warming below 2 degrees, but it may not be. So I just wanted to start by setting that national framework, because I think it's going to be really interesting. You may or may not know, and I'm sure you all do, that the Resource Management Act is under reform at the moment. And this is going to provide legislative and regulatory power to ensure that we do properly manage and adapt to the impacts of climate change. It's a very difficult time for councils right now because they're waiting to see, what that will mean. It's a really interesting time from the science front because we're providing information, more and more information that shows us that the window is closing. We don't have a lot of time to mitigate, to avoid the worst effects of climate change, but we also must adapt to some of the risks, some of the impacts that we simply can't avoid. So there we go. Sorry, I just jumped a slide there. There has been quite a bit in the media recently, and I think this is probably the reason I've been invited, thank you, David, around sea level rise. And in the beginning of May, we released our research program that David introduced. The New Zealand Sea Rise program released its projections for New Zealand. And there was quite a bit of media. It had quite a bit of uptake. We had the Prime Minister suggesting that these projections were not inevitable. Unfortunately, Prime Minister, some of them are, but yeah, absolutely the message is to keep reducing emissions to avoid the worst impacts. And yes, I have been interviewed, and so is my colleague Richard Levy and other members of the team. And I think recently you will have seen some articles in the Nelson region, in Stuff and in your local newspaper, suggesting that the impacts for the Nelson Tasman region could be a lot worse than perhaps you were prepared for, and perhaps what other parts of New Zealand will see. I live in Wellington, so I'm in the same boat as you guys. And I'll talk about why we have these dramatic sort of headlines in news articles that certain areas could be in real trouble in the coming decades. And yeah, I think the message here is not to shock, but to empower, and information is power. And, I think the community and the public need to understand there is time. And of course, our councils have time to put those regulations in place. But we definitely don't have time to, we have to recognize that it's, we have to move now. We've got no more time to sit on our hands for that. So I guess the furore and the media interest was over this website that we released in early May, and you can see, I hope, up the top there, the URL. You can go to that website. You can zoom right in. This is just a screenshot, so I can't give you a real-time version of it. But you can zoom into a place near you, a place you're interested in. You can click on the circle. You can see a sea level projection, a prediction for your area over the coming decades and centuries. Before I get into the details of the local sea level projections for New Zealand, I might just pull back a little bit and talk about the global picture. The world has been warming. It's warmed by about 1.2 degrees since the Industrial Revolution on average. And the clearest global-wide consequence of that really is sea level rise. And the sea level has risen around the world on average by 20 centimetres since we've been using coal, oil and gas as a cheap source of energy to power our societies and our economies. So there are lots of ways to measure the impacts of climate change, the consequences of climate change, but around the world we've been measuring it in our ports, our harbours with tide gauges, and more recently from satellite observations. And we know as you heat the planet, and particularly if you heat the ocean, and this is basic physics, if you heat water, it expands. And so sea level is rising from that heat. And it is also rising from the melting of the glaciers and the ice sheets that are melting and delivering fresh water to the ocean. So we've had 20 centimetres. It might not seem a lot. It's largely come, as I said, from the expansion of the ocean, from the heating of the ocean, and from the melting of the polar ice caps and glaciers. And maybe to put it in context, many of you will remember Hurricane Sandy, the big hurricane that hit Manhattan Island a decade or so ago. The damage from that would have been several $1 billion less had we not had sea level rise. So even that small amount of sea level rise was enough to shut down the subways, to cause major flooding and impact on the people of Manhattan Island. And of course, we don't have to talk about the developing world. We also know that for a place like Bangladesh, 20 centimetres of sea level rise is certainly a huge impact. So the average rate over the last 100 years has been about 1.5 millimetres per year, but there's a kick in the tail. There's an acceleration that is coming from the increased warming, and we're now starting to see an accelerated response of sea level rise where we're now currently at 3.5 millimetres per year globally. So where's that sea level rise coming from? As I mentioned, a lot of it has come from the thermal expansion of the ocean. As it heats, you heat water, it expands. And quite a bit of it has come from the melting of glaciers and ice sheets. The glaciers that are left on the planet today, if you ignore Greenland and Antarctica, only have about half a metre to give, and they will largely be gone by the end of the century. So they can give us another half a metre of global sea level rise. The Himalaya, the Andes, the European Alps, New Zealand's Southern Alps. The ice sheets have an enormous amount to give, and particularly the Antarctic ice sheet. And one of the really concerning signs is that we're seeing an acceleration in the loss of the polar ice sheets, and they are now dominating the signal of sea level rise we are seeing. So this is from the latest climate report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and you can see there the futures. These are our climate futures. These are our pathways of warming that will be determined by the amount of greenhouse gases we ultimately put in the atmosphere. And you can see I've highlighted this middle of the road pathway where we end up being about 2.5 degrees warmer by the end of the century. And this is the pathway we're on if you take into account what all the nations in the world are doing with their management and reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, if we burnt it all and just went crazy and just relied on fossil fuels for our energy for the future, we could end up 4.5 degrees warmer. And ideally, if we achieve the goals of the Paris Climate Agreement, we will end up less than 2 degrees warmer. And that is what New Zealand is aligned with. This is what our government is trying to do. This is what many governments in the world aspirationally want to do. But unfortunately, if you add it all up where we're at right now, we're heading sort of more for the 2.5 degrees. Hopefully we can end up down here, closer to a Paris world, which will limit the climate change impacts we actually have to adapt to and deal with. Okay, so what does that mean for sea level? So here are the same futures, you know, the best case scenario and the worst case scenario. This is what sea level might look like by the end of the century. And, you know, we've got to prepare for about 1 metre of sea level rise, of global sea level rise. The science is pretty solid and pretty uncontroversial on that. However, I mentioned the Antarctic ice sheet. The Antarctic ice sheet is unpredictable, and we worry that it could go a lot faster than sort of the conservative science is saying. And it's very clear from some of the research that has been done in the last few years in New Zealand and around the world, that the Antarctic ice sheet might go a lot quicker. And that's why we have this dashed line. And this is really quite an important outcome of the IPCC report. For the first time, they put in a future that perhaps the science isn't so certain on, but has big impacts and for the world. And so this is what we call a high impact but low likelihood storyline, where based on the science to date, we're not super confident about this, but the Antarctic ice sheet, and particularly the West Antarctic ice sheet, if it melted quickly, we could end up with 2 meters. We could end up with up to 2 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century. And that is why the IPCC says, this is the global climate report says to governments, to local government, to people responsible with decision making, it says don't rule out 2 meters of sea level rise by the end of the century. So, okay, it's pretty daunting, isn't it? You know, the best case scenario is 50 centimeters, and that isn't good, but the worst case scenario is 2 meters, and that's just terrible. So hopefully we avoid that. I'm just going to talk briefly about the Antarctic ice sheet before I come back to New Zealand. And it's something that New Zealand researchers are really leading the way on. And, you know, we've just had an Antarctic treaty meeting in Berlin, where science from around the world, but some New Zealand science has had a really big impact on the global nations about the potential for Antarctica to really do something quite dramatic as a result of global warming. And the problem we have with Antarctica is that if you pull this ice sheet off on the left, if you just take the ice sheet off and you look at the bedrock underneath, most of the, well, not most, but large parts of the ice sheet are actually sitting below sea level. Now, the ocean is warming, as I've said, because of climate change. 90% of the heat from global warming has gone into the ocean, and that heat is concentrated in the Southern Ocean around Antarctica. So we're very concerned about the melting, not from above, not top down, but from the bottom up, as the ocean around Antarctica begins to warm and it begins to get into the soft underbelly of the Antarctic ice sheet, with consequences for very dramatic sea level rise. And I'll show you what I mean. Okay, I'm going to set a model off here on the left. The top one is a bad future. This is the worst case future. The bottom one is a Paris future where we achieve the Paris target. And I'm melting the Antarctic ice sheet. And you can see by 2200, right now, we've almost 200 years into the future, we've almost lost the West Antarctic ice sheet. We have lost the West Antarctic ice sheet. So this is a world in which we do not curb or abate our emissions, we just go crazy, and we're sort of on that path. The world below is a world in which we achieved the Paris target, which is the black line. The red line was the top one. Black line is the bottom one. And what this is saying, and it's a good news message, is if we achieve the Paris target and keep global warming below 2 degrees, then we save, essentially we save the Antarctic ice sheet from meltdown, and we only get a very small contribution to sea level rise. But as you can see from the red curve, if we let it go and we don't curb our emissions, we get around about a metre by the end of the century, but we get 15 meters in the coming centuries. So, you know, this is one of the problems. There is a tipping point in the Antarctic ice sheet that is somewhere around the Paris Climate Agreement. So I guess the point I'm trying to make to you all is that when it comes to predicting sea level rise for New Zealand, there are two things that really matter that we need to know more about. One is what the Antarctic ice sheet will do. And I think you can see from what I've showed you that, you know, if we can do our best to keep global warming lower than or around 2 degrees, we can head that one off. The other one is related to what the land will do. And this is the big part of the talk. So if we cast our minds back to 2017, the Ministry for the Environment put out a report, a guidance to local government for dealing with climate change and particularly sea level rise. And it put out a set of projections, pretty much the same set of projections for the whole of New Zealand. And this is it here. It said by the end of the century, you should be planning for sea level rise somewhere between 1.2 to, you know, half a metre, depending on which climate future we had. And this is really what regional councils, local government have been using in their planning and decision-making around, you know, what climate change might do. The red line up here is a little bit higher than the global average because it does include the Antarctic ice sheet. And I want to make a shout out to my colleague, Rob Bill, who was a co-author of this report back in 2017, who said, yeah, let's put in a little bit extra if Antarctica does something crazy. So this is what we've had. This is our guidance. This is what we've been using as our scientific basis for preparing for the impacts of climate change. In the last 10 years, and really since this report, we've had a lot more information that we've managed to gather from satellites that circle around the Earth, obviously. And in this case, this satellite sends radar signals and bounces them off the land and receives them again, and can measure very accurately how the elevation of the land surface is changing. And it can do that at the scale of individual houses, bridges, ports, airports. So it's a really powerful tool. The other thing we've had is GPS, or the Global Navigation Satellite Systems, GNSS, and GeoNet at GNS Science have a number of these stations around the country measuring the change in vertical land elevation. And it turns out that New Zealand is highly dynamic. Bits are going up, bits are going down all the time, and that's in between earthquakes, right? So we obviously know about it when we get a Kaikoura or we get a Christchurch earthquake. But in between that, parts of New Zealand are going up and they're going down, and they really make a measurable difference to sea level change. Obviously, if the land is going down and we know global sea level is going up, that adds to the amount and rate of sea level rise. If the land is going up, then that can offset some of the sea level rise. So knowing exactly the pattern of land movement in your part of the world is incredibly important for anticipating and managing those impacts. So what we've done with the New Zealand Sea Rise Program is for the entire coastal strip of New Zealand at 2 kilometre spacing, we have measured what the land surface is doing. And this map on the right is the basis behind that. And what it shows you is the velocity or the rate at which the land is either rising or sinking. So white areas of the coastline, you can see here, the land is stable. Blue areas, the land is sinking. And you can see that around the southern Wellington, southeastern North Island, Wairarapa coast, Marlborough, Nelson. These are the hotspots. This is the area where New Zealand is sinking, and sinking at rates up to 8 millimetres per year. So just hold that number. 8 millimetres per year is the worst, is the highest rate of sinking, and global sea level is going up at 3.5 millimetres per year globally. So you can add those two together, and that's a big number. That's 12 millimetres per year of relative sea level rise, potentially where you live today. It's not that bad for Nelson, but I'll come back to that. For large parts of the South Island, we're pretty stable. And for large parts of the North Island, we're pretty stable. Auckland was a surprise to us. Auckland is subsiding as well. And the Nelson, Wellington, Auckland region are generally subsiding at greater than 2 millimetres per year, based on those satellite measurements, but calibrated to the GPS measurements as well. So if we zoom in on Wellington, you can see not only that the 2 kilometre space circles around the coastline of Wellington, and the blue numbers, remember, are the land sinking, and up to 5 millimetres per year in parts of Wellington. But you can also see we have this information for all the land inland as well. And so when we're thinking about sea level rise and what that means for rivers and flooding up the Hutt Valley, for example, we can also deal with that as well. But for this talk, I'm just focusing you on this area because we have quite high rates of subsidence. And that effectively, as you've heard in the media, doubles the amount of sea level rise and shortens the time we have before we get into trouble with, certain thresholds being breached. And I'll get to that. A lot of graphs here. Just want to point out to you that, these tide gauges are very important. And on the left here is the Auckland, the Wellington, the Tauranga, the Christchurch or Lyttelton, and the Dunedin tide gauge. And what you're seeing is a time series from about the year 2000 through to present day. And you can see that the Auckland tide gauge is sinking. You can see the GPS unit on the Wellington tide gauge is really sinking. Interesting that the Kaikoura earthquake caused Wellington to go up a bit. Tauranga didn't feel any of the earthquakes, and it's pretty stable. But of course, Christchurch was subsiding, and then boom, 2011, it had a big vertical land movement, but then it subsided since. So it's back to its usual pattern of sinking. And Dunedin just carries on oblivious to it all. It didn't feel any of those earthquakes on the tide gauge. But what I'm trying to say here is that the tide gauges in most of our major ports, except Tauranga, are actually sinking. And that's because on those timescales, the land is sinking. And what that does is it adds to the amount of sea level rise you might get in the future. So for Auckland, if we take all the possible climate futures at the Auckland tide gauge in 130 odd years, we would expect to see between 60 centimetres and 2 metres of sea level rise, depending on which climate future we follow. And clearly the red ones are the hotter futures, the blue is nearer the Paris future. For Wellington, that's a big number as well because of vertical land movement. And so we're just showing you, I guess I'm just showing you the historical records that go back to the beginning of the century for Auckland and Wellington in particular, and that we've seen global sea level rise, that's the 20 centimetres I mentioned, but this is what we're in for in the future. And I guess the point I'm trying to make is the tide gauges are measuring exactly the same rates of sea level rise that we are also measuring with the satellites. So these are real measurements. I want to talk quickly about earthquakes. Earthquakes change everything, as we know. And so the sea level projections we are putting out for the Nelson Tasman region are the rates of sea level rise that you would expect without an earthquake. Here's an example from Kaikoura. This is today. If you go to our website and you click on these buttons and see what's happening around Kaikoura, you'll see the land is sinking at 2 to 3 to 4 millimetres per year, even up to 5 millimetres per year. Before the earthquake, that is exactly what the land was doing. That's what happens. That area is sinking. The earthquake then popped it up 5 metres, as we know. And since then, this is the satellite vertical land movement velocity. Since then, it's sinking, but it's not sinking at 5 millimetres per year. It's sinking at 150 millimetres per year after the Kaikoura earthquake. Of course, that's slowed down now. It's not sinking that fast. But so all an earthquake does is it causes massive disruption, and much more than you get from slow sea level change. But after the earthquake, the land returns to the pattern of subsidence it had before. So people in New Brighton are quite disturbed at the moment because in New Brighton down in Christchurch, the land is sinking at 8 millimetres per year. And that's post-earthquake relaxation, which is even more than they had before the earthquake. So earthquakes really do mess up everything, and generally not in a good way. But the thing to remember for New Zealand is, on average, if you live in the Nelson-Marlborough region, you wouldn't expect a major earthquake. It would be every 100 years, okay? So when it comes to planning whether you should build a new library or an airport, you're thinking on the decade timescale. And on that timescale, you need to be thinking about what the land is doing. Yes, at the end of the day, an earthquake will probably pop Nelson up. But before that earthquake happens, the Nelson Tasman region is sinking. And if you're going to be developing anything near the coastline, roads, infrastructure, ports, you need to be thinking about the fact that over the coming decades, we expect the land to sink at the same time sea level is rising. So if you go on our website, this is what you'll see. You will see blue dots everywhere. And these blue dots mean the land is sinking up to 5 millimetres per year. And the one we pick out the most is this one down here in Richmond. But there are many places, Ruby Bay, all around the coastline here. The land is sinking, and it will continue to do that for decades to come. Okay, now this is a complicated diagram, but these are your futures, Nelson. This is your tide gauge, which has been going up. And the blue lines are the best futures you could hope for. And the black lines, unfortunately, are the worst futures you could hope for. And each of these is tied to a global warming scenario. So, of course, the blue is the Paris target. The dashed lines are without vertical land movement. So this one here is a Paris future. But of course, the land is sinking. So your real sea level rise, Nelson, is this blue line. And as I said before, the orange line is the future we are on. So if we look at the timescale down here, between 2040 and 2060, we are going to approach about 40 centimetres of sea level rise for the Nelson Tasman region. That can't be avoided, actually. It's pretty much baked in. It'll be slightly more or slightly less, depending on how we deal with our global emissions. So I put a dashed line across there at 37 centimetres. The earliest we could reach that is about 2040 or 2035 even. And then if we're lucky, it could not be until 2060, but depending on where we are. But this is actually for the site where the plan is to build a library. So I've chosen that Trafalgar Park site just to show to you how much time you have before your sea level will be about 40 centimetres higher. Now, why is that important? That's important because that's a threshold. The 100-year, the worst 100-year the 100-year coastal flooding, the worst flooding you can imagine, that happens every 100 years with 40 centimetres of sea level rise will happen every year. So you're not just planning for 40 centimetres of sea level rise, you're planning for the storm surge, the wave setup that happens in the 100-year flood that will be happening every year, which will be a 2.8 to 3 metre sea level rise instantaneous for your region. So this is a really important point, is that when we adapt to climate change and particularly to sea level rise, we are not adapting to the average global sea level rise. We are not adapting to the local sea level rise. We're adapting to the extreme event, storm event on that sea level rise. And what's critical here from a planning threshold point of view is if you're getting 3 metres every year, then that's simply not sustainable. That's a big engineering problem to defend against. Okay, so let's look around the region at some of the hotspots. Often Richmond gets pulled out, but I'm very aware, having talked to the District Council, that many of the new subdivisions in Richmond are on quite high ground, but I know there are parts of Richmond exposed, particularly along the state highway. And you have a rate of sea level rise because of land subsidence. That means you'll get the 100-year devastating flood every year by the year 2035. So that only really gives you 12 years before you have to do something about that. This is the road around, of course, to Nelson from Richmond. And there's no question that's vulnerable. Again, 2050, you're getting that threshold event every year. And here's an area further out towards, I guess, Rabbit Island. So this is just an example of what we call the 1% AEP. The 100-year flood becomes an annual event with 37 centimetres of sea level rise. And depending on where you are on the coastline in Tasman, Nelson, that will be between 2035 and 2050 for a lot of places. But, we're all in the same boat. This is Petone. And this is just an example. The dashed line is the sea level rise we were using in the coastal hazards guidance. And this is the best case scenario if we achieve the Paris Agreement. And then the solid line is once you add in that land sinking, vertical land movement. And what that means for that annual threshold where we get the 100-year flood every year, that's come forward from 2070 to 2040 for Wellington, for Korokoro, for Petone, for Days Bay, for a lot of the coastline around Wellington. So there's still time, but the time is about half as long as we thought we had. And if you're wondering what a 100-year flood looks like, this is the one that hit the Firth of Thames, the Hauraki area, southern Firth of Thames in 2018. It pretty much did in the road between Thames and Coromandel, completely flooded the townships of Kaiawa, Miranda, and you can see that on the Waikato Regional Council flood map. So these events are big events, and you don't want them happening every year. Vertical land movements are crazy in that they can change a lot in a very short distance. So this is the Hawke's Bay example, and I'm showing you here Haumoana, Tiawanga. This is often a poster child for New Zealand's sea level impacts. This subdivision, these coastal houses are being smashed all the time, but they're actually in an area where the land is pretty stable. So this is just climate-driven sea level change. You go to the airport at Ahuriri in the Napier region. So there's a photo of the airport. It is sinking at almost 5 millimeters per year. And, you know, it's just unviable long-term because of that rate of subsidence. And they've already spent a lot of money on that airport, and it already is in danger of high tide flooding and requires pumping. We have 5 airports, including the Nelson Airport, around the country that are vulnerable to sea level rise. Here's an example of coastal change. The Westport Airport, you can see it in 2005, you can see it again in 2020. Look how close that cliff has got to the edge of the runway. And this is something that we have not yet dealt with our new projections. We can't tell you what this means for coastal erosion or coastal sedimentation. So this is where local councils will be commissioning studies to say, okay, if we get this amount of sea level rise, what does that mean for our airport? Will the coastline grow out? Will the coastline retreat? And in some cases, it actually does get more sand, but that's unusual. In most places, it doesn't, it retreats. But here's an example in Australia where, in actual fact, rising sea level caused a change in sediment transport and supply that the beach at Coolangatta actually built out. I want to talk about beyond the end of the century, just to finish up. And I think I do need to finish up so we can have some questions. You know, sea level doesn't stop magically at 2100. It doesn't stop at 2150. It continues for centuries to come. And we have to take a long-term view towards future sea level rise, not just the lifetime of a library or an airport. We have to think about the community over intergenerational timescales. And this is where the voice of Māori, the values of Māori, are intrinsic to the values we need to take and adopt as New Zealanders for dealing with sea level rise. That concept of stewardship and guardianship, kaitiakitanga, the knowledge that comes from long time frames is super important. And we're working very closely with Māori because their voice is very strong and it's equitable. A lot of Māori communities are the most exposed. They're poor and they're vulnerable. And this is one of the things I think we sometimes forget, is that, you know, the rich might be able to afford seawalls, but the rest of the community is going to have to retreat. So here's a marae in Mitimiti up in the Hokianga that is clearly, oh, actually that's not the same marae, but it's similar marae, and it's clearly very close to sea level. And so, you know, if you're going to move cultural, you know, assets of cultural significance like urupā, burial grounds, your ancestors, you don't want to do it many times. You want to do it once and you want to get it right. So taking a long-term perspective is also critical in the decision-making process, depending on the lifetime of your infrastructure, how long you expect a building to last for, or whether you're thinking about the long-term resilience of your cultural assets or your communities. So some concluding remarks, and I'll hand over to you, David and Joanna. I think, you know, we need to feel empowered and hopeful. The fact we have this information now has probably got a lot of local councillors rubbing their heads going, oh my God, we've got to deal with this now. So, you know, I do feel for the councils. You know, information is great, but then you have to incorporate that information and you don't always have the resources for it. The comment I would make to decision makers and councillors is that the future is uncertain. We might end up on a Paris future where we only get 50 centimetres of sea level rise, or we might end up in a worst case scenario where we get 2 metres of sea level rise by the end of the century. So we must take an approach that can be flexible and adaptive. The important point is there's time. The science tells us there's still time to adapt and avoid and manage the worst impacts of sea level rise and climate change. I think it's really important not to have a building by building perspective, but you need to take a regional holistic perspective to this. Don't just think about floor heights in a single building and whether they'll be flooded. Think about whether that building will be accessible, whether it will have a road to it, whether it will have the infrastructure, the sewage, the underground infrastructure, the utilities, all of that. And so I think when coming up with an adaptation plan, you have to take that holistic view. How is the whole region going to respond, going to feel sea level rise? Where are the hotspots? You can plan for the average, but that doesn't really help you if you have a point of weakness that takes out a main highway or a train line. So you've got to be really focused on the broader holistic regional exposure and come up with a plan that deals with that. What I would say in terms of how to use these sea level projections, and when you burrow into it, and I'm not going to talk about it here, but there are uncertainties. Is it valid to take 4 millimeters per year subsidence for Richmond and say that will continue out 100 years into the future? Maybe yes, maybe no. I would say it's more valid to use that rate than to hope for an earthquake to save you. Not that an earthquake will save you. However, what I would say, monitoring is everything. So I think councils need to put in place GPS, co-located tide gauges. Communities need to continually measure so that they can see if their sea level future is going along the path that perhaps we predicted it would be, or whether it's got worse, or whether it's got better, and then to adapt to that. So it's really important from an adaptation point of view, not to lock in path dependency. Don't predict a future that might never happen because it's unrealistic, but also don't gold plate it to a level where it's unnecessarily expensive. So having that dynamic adaptive approach is absolutely key to dealing with that. But you need the tools in place to be measuring that sea level change so that you're constantly revising your planning and your decision making. And I know there's some council people listening tonight, so I just wanted to share that on behalf of some of my colleagues who feel very strongly about these approaches. So that's all I have to say. Thank you, ngā mihi nui. It's been great talking to you.
Thank you, Tim. That's fantastic. I will perhaps read a question, and then the plan is that Joanna will pick up a question. We'll obviously not have time to cover everything, but being entirely objective, I'm going to start with a question from Olivia, who happens to be a member of our forum. And Olivia has spoken to our group once about some of the topics you're covering, and has, I think, a personal felt ambition to communicate some of this information better. How can we get research analysis and information like you're doing, Tim, better out into our community?
You want me to answer that question?
What's your experience so far in the way you've been doing this sort of stuff for a while, right? Both in relation to the Antarctic, but also in relation to this current project.
Yeah.
What resonates?
I think, honesty resonates. I think if we're overly dramatic and we always talk about the worst case scenarios, I think we turn people off. So I think what you'll have noticed with the way I've communicated tonight is I'm looking at the best case futures, really, the Paris future, the future we're on. So I'm not trying to scare, I'm not trying to over-egg the pudding, make it sound worse than it is. But I think it's really important to be honest, but also to be constructive and to be able to offer, the fact that we know these things and we can predict these things gives you time to respond, gives you time to come up with the solution that is fair and appropriate for your community. And I think when it comes to communication, you don't need scientists like me yelling down the Zoom link. You need communities to be completely consulted and engaged. And, you know, that's something we're very aware of. We're trying to talk. We feel the responsibility as scientists to share the knowledge we have, but we're not arrogant enough to think we know the local solutions for local communities. And so I don't know whether you should have a library or not. I don't know what the right solution is for Nelson. I wouldn't pretend to, but that's up to your council and your communities to work that through. And you've got to be really honest and have an honest conversation about all the information that's at your fingertips. So you put in place the right solutions that give you a long-term sustainable future. But, you know, I just think it's communication and as many different parts of the community and, you know, the private sector and the government sector all talking to each other.
Okay, our next question is quite related to that idea of how it applies to our local region. And it's Rachel starts with Kia ora, Tim, brilliant presentation, thank you. And she goes on to say regarding the Nelson Airport, they're planning on investing up to 100 million in a runway extension in the same coastal location sometime after 2026. Is this prudent, or should we be considering options for retreating and relocating an airport further inland?
Look, I think airports are a tough one. And I wouldn't want to really tell Nelson what the solution is because I don't know. But what I would say with airports is they're there for a certain reason. You know, it's a safe, easy place to land planes, and often they're very close to sea level. So, you know, the solution depends on, you know, all the requirements from the community and the airport. If you can engineer it, that you can have a viable, resilient airport in the same location and rebuild the runway, still be able to get access to it and service the local region, then why not? I mean, it's just a matter of money, isn't it? How much you spend on that. And it may be that you don't have an alternative location you can go to. So as far as airports go, you know, I get that it's tricky, and we've got Wellington, we've got Napier, we've got Auckland, all thinking about runway extensions and what they do. But you certainly don't want to end up as a stranded asset that you have to canoe to. So, you know, that's sort of part of the thinking, I guess.
There's a question here, Tim, about communities, and you've mentioned about how councils should monitor more. And the question on coastal communities is partly about what they can do to adapt as a community. You've touched on that, but could you add any further thoughts about that, please?
Oh boy, you know, this starts to really push me. I'm a scientist, and you know, again, I want to be careful about, you know, advising communities.
Right.
There's a fairness thing, there's an equity thing here, and there's also a who pays thing here. And hopefully we'll get some clarity around that with the legislation that's coming through Parliament. You know, we've heard the government say we're not going to pay the full cost of managed retreat, for example. And then the question becomes, okay, how do you share that cost? Because you can't put it all on the individual in the community, and maybe it's unfair to put it all on the government. And so working out, you know, if you had an earthquake tomorrow in Nelson, you'd probably have insurance come to the, you know, and provide funding to rebuild. But this is a much slower moving earthquake that we have time to manage, and to manage in a sustainable way. And so, you know, I don't know. I mean, I think there's a lot of equity issues here that communities will all have different issues that they need to resolve, and local government and government have to put in place some sort of framework around that. I mean, I've heard Judy Lawrence say it many, many times that the cost of adaptation will ultimately come to the taxpayer, and it will. But how that's done in a way that's fair and equitable is the challenge, and sustainable for the future.
Thanks.
Here is more like an engineering question than a social community question. Is there any way that we can divert sediment coming out of rivers like the Motueka away from the seabed and instead feed along the coast to build up land to protect against sea level rise, as they're doing in Louisiana from Antarctica land?
Yeah, look, this is a big topic of discussion, and again, sorry, it's, there's local solutions for local problems and not one size fits all. And in some cases, there are clear engineering opportunities where you could put a groin in, or you could build something that would trap sand and buy you a few decades maybe. But again, you've got to take that bigger picture. I mean, you can protect your part of the coastline potentially, but then you might find that the whole region around you has had to retreat. So I think, it's like some of the people in Granity, and that's a classic example on the west coast of the South Island, where some of the locals started building their own seawalls. But if the neighbour doesn't want to build a seawall, then your seawall's not going to be very successful. So, these engineering solutions are all possible, and, with money, anything's possible, but it's whether it's the appropriate solution for the long term. That's the question.
There's a question about the data, and this goes back to what your Sea Rise project is doing, and it's going to continue for a few more years yet. Could you say something more about how you're going to extend the research, please?
Well, we hope to get some more funding. This is the fragility of the New Zealand science system at the moment, is that we've got this tool for New Zealand, for the public and for decision makers, but it needs updating as we get new science, as we get more and longer observations from satellites and GPS, as we get better information about how the Antarctic ice sheet might respond, we can build that in. And the hope is we can reduce the uncertainties. So for the future, we have a $15 million proposal pending with the Ministry for Business, Innovation and Employment. If we get funded, we'll be able to continue this work for another 5 years and hopefully build it into a long-term national capability to support adaptation for New Zealand. And when we do this, one of the things we hope to do is to actually build in the risk of earthquakes as well as the changes between, so that we can actually give decision makers some information about when this fault might actually go off and change things dramatically. We hope to use a new generation of satellite data that we'll be able to give information from building to, is your neighbour sinking? Are you okay? Is that bridge safe? That's the sort of level that we are finding the end users, the decision makers, particularly the insurance sector, are quite interested in. And so we're going for that level of granularity.
Thank you.
It's my turn now, is it?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I must say that that's helpful to understand that you're moving in that direction, Tim, in terms of being able to provide information, which has to do with the next question from Marie Lindaya. Some Nelson residents have received a letter on liquefaction. Should they sell up and move, knowing that there's a shortage of land with urban sprawl, and maybe city intensification is no longer an option?
Yeah, look, I couldn't possibly offer anything useful on that because I don't know anything about that particular place. Of course, liquefaction, particularly, I can use Christchurch as the example, is now a big concern after an earthquake. And yeah, that's another thing that gets exacerbated by sea level rise as the groundwater rises and liquefies the ground. So I couldn't possibly comment on the specific case. Certainly wouldn't want to tell you whether you should sell up or not. But it's something that's probably worth getting a geotechnical expert to have a look at and give you some advice on.
Possibly we should bring this to a conclusion now. I think gone through our time. On Thursday evening, there'll be a panel which Joanna is going to be helping have with some people in the two councils to discuss some of the issues relating to both climate action and adaptation, I understand. So anyone here who would like to raise questions that have not had answered or feel frustrated about, I think there will be opportunity at that panel too to follow up on some of these points. Will there, Joanna?
Yes. Yes, I will.
This is the first word, not the last word on this topic. So thank you, Tim, for joining us, and thank you everybody for being in this webinar tonight.
Thank you, David.
Thank you and good night.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.